Somewhere along the way, we were sold a lie about what intelligence looks like in business. The lie goes like this: the person at the top should be the smartest person in the room. The founder should understand every function. The leader should be able to step into any role, answer any question, solve any problem. Expertise should be total. Knowledge should be comprehensive. And any gap in that knowledge is a vulnerability to be hidden rather than a resource to be filled. It is a convincing lie. It sounds like high standards. It sounds like the kind of relentless competence that separates the exceptional from the ordinary. But what it actually produces, in the people who believe it completely and build their working lives around it, is a particular kind of exhaustion and a particular kind of ceiling that competence alone can never break through. Because the most successful businesses in the world are not run by the smartest individual in any given room. They are run by the person who was wise enough to fill the room with people smarter than themselves, and humble enough to listen when those people spoke. Sandy had not learned this yet. Stay with us, because today we are telling the story of a man who nearly ran his business into the ground trying to be everything it needed, and what shifted the moment he stopped trying to play every instrument and started learning how to conduct. And if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe, because somebody out there needs to hear exactly this today. Sandy was 34 years old and had built his small manufacturing business on the conviction that if something needed doing properly, he was the one who needed to do it. This was not arrogance in the conventional sense. Sandy was not a person who believed himself superior to others. He was a person who had learned, through a specific set of experiences in his late 20s, that depending on other people produced inconsistent results. He had been let down by partners. He had hired people who had not delivered. He had trusted advice that had turned out to be wrong in ways that cost him money and time he could not easily recover. The lesson he had taken from these experiences was not that he needed to find better people. It was that he needed to need fewer people. He had built his business accordingly. 5 years in, the business worked. It was not thriving in the way Sandy had imagined when he started it, not growing at the pace he had envisioned, not operating at the margin he knew was theoretically possible. But it worked. Orders came in. Products went out. Customers returned. By any reasonable measure, it was a functional, sustainable small business. It was also entirely dependent on Sandy for almost everything that mattered. He handled the sales conversations because he understood the product better than anyone. He managed the supplier relationships because he had built them and trusted nobody else to maintain them with the same care. He oversaw the production scheduling because he knew from experience that errors in scheduling created downstream problems that took weeks to untangle. He handled the bookkeeping because he had been burned once by an accountant who had missed something significant and had decided that the only safe approach was to keep the finances inside his own field of vision. He was the salesperson, the operations manager, the procurement lead, the financial controller, and the production scheduler of a business that employed 6 people and should, by rights, have been able to distribute these functions across a team that specialized in them. Instead, he distributed them across the 14 hours of his own daily life. The cracks appeared gradually. They always do. A sales opportunity that required more follow-up than Sandy had time to give, lost to a competitor who responded faster. A supplier relationship that needed attention during a period when Sandy was consumed by a production problem, deteriorating quietly until the pricing conversation that followed was less favorable than it should have been. A bookkeeping backlog that had grown long enough that the accountant Sandy eventually hired to clean it up found 3 months of errors that had been compounding in directions Sandy had not noticed because he had been too busy doing everything else to look carefully at any one thing. He was doing everything. He was doing nothing well. The realization arrived not from a crisis, but from a conversation Sandy had not planned to have. He was at a regional business event, the kind he attended twice a year with the vague intention of networking and the consistent execution of standing near the refreshments and talking to whoever happened to be nearby. The person who happened to be nearby on this occasion was an older man named Clifford who had built and sold 2 manufacturing businesses before what he described, with visible contentment, as a semi-retirement that mostly involved advising people who reminded him of his younger self. Sandy did not know any of this when the conversation started. It began the way these conversations begin, with pleasantries and the mutual assessment that happens in the first 2 minutes of talking to a stranger at a professional event. Sandy mentioned his business. Clifford asked a few questions, not the questions Sandy was used to, not about the product or the market or the revenue. Questions about the team, about how the functions were distributed, about who handled what. Sandy answered honestly. It did not take long for the picture to become clear. Clifford was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Sandy turned over for weeks afterward. He said, "You are playing every instrument in the orchestra. And I promise you, none of them sound as good as they would if the right person was playing them." Sandy started to say something about the difficulty of finding reliable people. Clifford nodded before he finished the sentence, as though he had heard this particular explanation many times before. He said, "The problem is not finding people who know more than you in their area. Those people exist and they are not hard to find. The problem is that you have decided that needing them is a weakness. It is not. It is the whole job. The conductor of an orchestra," Clifford said, "does not play every instrument, cannot play every instrument, would produce something significantly worse than what the orchestra produces if they tried. The conductor's skill is entirely different from the musician's skill, and it is not lesser for being different. It is the thing that makes everything else possible. The ability to understand what each instrument contributes, to create the conditions in which each player does their best work, to hear the whole and know when any part of it needs adjustment. That is what running a business actually is," Clifford said. "And the sooner you stop auditioning for first violin and start learning to conduct, the sooner your business becomes something that can grow beyond what one person can carry." Sandy drove home from that event quieter than he had arrived. He spent the following 2 weeks doing something he had not done since the early days of the business, looking at it honestly from the outside. Not at what was working, but at what each function actually required, and whether his involvement in it was making it better or simply keeping it inside his control. The conclusions were uncomfortable. His involvement in the sales process was not making it better. It was making it slower, because Sandy could not give it the sustained, focused attention that good sales required. His management of the supplier relationships was not producing better outcomes. It was producing the same outcomes that a dedicated procurement person would produce, at the cost of the attention that should have been going elsewhere. His bookkeeping was producing errors that a qualified bookkeeper would not make. He was not the best person for most of what he was doing. He was simply the person who had decided nobody else could be trusted to do it. Over the following 6 months, Sandy hired a part-time bookkeeper, brought in a sales coordinator, and restructured the supplier relationships under a team member who had, it turned out, been capable of managing them for years, and had simply never been given the authority. Each hire cost money he had been reluctant to spend. Each one returned something that the money could not fully measure, hours of Sandy's attention redirected toward the things that actually required him. Decisions made by people who understood their function more deeply than Sandy ever had. A business that began, for the first time in years, to feel like it was running rather than being carried. By the end of the year, revenue had grown by 22%. Not because Sandy had become smarter or more capable or more disciplined. Because he had finally stopped trying to play every instrument and started learning what conductors actually do. You do not need to be the smartest person in the room to build something exceptional. You need the curiosity to understand what each function requires, the persistence to find people who are genuinely excellent at those functions, and the wisdom, perhaps the rarest ingredient of all, to trust those people enough to let them do the work you brought them to do. The businesses that scale are not the ones with the most capable founder at the center of every decision. They are the ones where the founder understood their actual role early enough to build around it rather than around themselves. The orchestra does not need the conductor to play every instrument. It needs the conductor to make every instrument sound like the best version of itself. Sandy spent 5 years playing everything. The day he picked up the baton instead was the day the music finally started. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today.